Thank you everyone for joining us tonight. My name is Bill Valerio. I'm the director of Woodmere, the museum that you see all around me, and we're going to be talking tonight about one of the most exciting events in the history of this institution, which is the acquisition of a building that's known as St. Michael's Hall. And we've got a great team assembled here tonight. The purpose of this meeting is feedback on ideas and conceptual thoughts about how we are going to make St. Michael's Hall function as a museum building. It's the first of many such community events of this kind, but literally before we even settle on the property, we wanted to gather people together and put out on the table what it is that we're thinking. That's what this is about. This is the first of many such conversations. What I would also say from the very beginning is the property is zoned residential. We can't have a functioning museum in a residential property, so there will need to be code changes in terms of the zoning. And a lot of what you'll see tonight has to do with how we're thinking of making the adjustments to the space so that it can be functional as a museum. So, with that said, if you're here in the audience, we're going to be glad to answer questions. I think we're going to let the speakers speak and then do questions at the end. If you are online, please put questions into the Q&A, or you can put questions into the chat. There are staff members of the museum who are monitoring it, and they will channel the questions into the room, and we're going to try to get to every question that there is. So welcome everyone. You are looking at an aerial view of this part of Chestnut Hill with Woodmere, and I'm just going to test the laser, the pointer. So here's Woodmere, and here is St. Michael's Hall. We've counted the steps from here to here, and it's 72 steps away, which is very exciting for us. And I wanted to describe first just what Woodmere's vision is and how this change is going to sort of feel in terms of the functioning of the institution. We will remain Woodmere. We will be one museum, Woodmere Art Museum, but we will exist in two buildings, two important and wonderful historic buildings, and we will offer two very distinct experiences with different elements, different museum functions happening in each of the two spaces. In Woodmere's main building, which you see here with our tower up here on the left, our founders collection with its superlative collection of Hudson River paintings and 19th century Philadelphia landscapes and figurative arts will remain here at Woodmere. However, 20th century art and contemporary art will have a new home in St. Michael's Hall, and you see a rendering of what we're imagining as a gallery that will be a space for Violet Oakley's spectacular murals from the Arnold House downtown. And these are works of art from 1910. So 19th century Woodmere main building, 20th century, pretty much starting with Violet Oakley in St. Michael's Hall. Special exhibitions like the exhibition that's on the wall around us by works of art by the artist Larry Day will continue to happen here at Woodmere's main building. We will have dedicated galleries for contemporary art in St. Michael's Hall. And between modern art and contemporary art, St. Michael's Hall will be dedicated to 20th century Philadelphia, and Woodmere's collection will have a home. We are envisioning St. Michael's Hall as a place where Woodmere's permanent collection can be on view. And I just want to kind of unpack that a little bit. What people don't know about Woodmere is that Woodmere's collection is one of the great collections of American art, and something that I feel holds us back as an institution is that the collection is not accessible in a way that people can build relationships with the individual great masterpieces that are in the collection. And that's not an exaggeration. And I wanted to give just sort of a very, very quick rundown of the strengths of Woodmere's collection. Impressionism as it evolved in Philadelphia. I'm not calling it Pennsylvania Impressionism anymore. I've decided that that label is just no good. We can talk about that another time. I'm now calling it American Impressionism as it evolved in Philadelphia. That is one of the cornerstones of Woodmere's collection. It's one of the most popular parts of our collection. It will have a dedicated gallery in St. Michael's Hall. Impressionism, modernism, I'm showing the Arthur Karl's abstract bouquet. Philadelphia had abstract expressionism before New York, and it was right here in Chestnut Hill. Arthur Karl's lived on Evergreen, and this is one of the great examples of American modernism. Karl's was one of the artists who brought European modernism to the United States. And then the other very important part of Woodmere's collection is the reimagination of the figurative arts as they evolved in the 20th century. Philadelphia is a city of realism in the arts, going back to the Peels and Thomas Eakins. And in the 20th century, artists had to come to terms with that legacy and build on it, and build on what's wonderful about that legacy. That's what this Larry Day show is about. But I'm showing an example of a work by the artist Edith Neff, who was a student of Larry Day, just by the way, and a work from the 1930s of the Italian market by Albert Gold, a more social realist kind of approach to realism in the arts. But this is a very big part of Woodmere's collection that we don't have dedicated galleries for, and we will be able to have galleries for all of this in St. Michael's Hall. And here's a terrific painting by the contemporary artist Jonathan Lyden Chase. The hottest artist in America right now, or one of them, and we happen to have several really great works by him in the collection here, and we ought to have them on view. A full 25% of Woodmere's collection is Violet Oakley and the Red Rose Girls. And what's so exciting to me about St. Michael's Hall is that we will be able to have this collection again on view. And I'm showing I'm showing the Yarnell House murals again, portraits by Violet Oakley. Here's a portrait of Edith Emerson, who is the director of this museum. Her friend Beatrice, oh man, the famous cellist who did all the cello, all the cello premieres for the Philadelphia Orchestra. I'm forgetting her name right now. A spectacular, really large scale, larger than life portrait by Violet Oakley. It should always be on view. And then, because it's not only about Violet Oakley, it's about the Red Rose Girls. And here's an example of a really wonderful painting by Jessie Wilcox Smith of the Butcher children who lived, walking distance from, where we are right now. But the idea that this great strength of Woodmere's collection, Woodmere owns this stuff. Owns it in the sense that there's no other American art museum that can touch this. And what's happened, with the revisions and rethinking of, what American art is, Violet Oakley is an anchoring figure, and you can't know Violet Oakley if you don't know Woodmere's collection. And that, for me as the director of the museum, is why St. Michael's Hall is such a transformation. It will change Woodmere's profile in the spectrum of American museums in a very profound way. It will also change the kinds of experiences that we are able to offer, to our communities, to people who can, people build relationships with works of art. And if they're on view in an ongoing way, that can start to happen. St. Michael's Hall is about something that goes beyond Woodmere itself. St. Michael's Hall is a community preservation project, and I look around the room here, and I know so many of all of you from different facets of the passion and commitment to preserve the green space, of Northwest Philadelphia and of Philadelphia in general, historic preservation of important houses and important buildings, the architectural history of Philadelphia, and Woodmere, which is a community-based museum that lives and has these values just deeply embedded, in our smallest fingernails. We could not take this opportunity to engage with St. Michael's Hall as a community preservation project, and you'll hear in a minute about what some of those alternatives to Woodmere's use could have been. You can see on the screen some beautiful historic details in the building, and the beautiful green space. Woodmere's grounds are 6 acres. The grounds of St. Michael's Hall are 4 acres. And I thought that, in speaking about the land, it was a good opportunity for Woodmere to express its, honoring of the Lenape, who, lived in this area before we did and populated this area before we do. And you'll be hearing from Darren Damone of Andropogon just about the ideas that we have for the expression of this landscape, and our honoring of the Lenape, will be built into our thinking about this gorgeous piece of land, this green space at St. Michael's Hall. So that's incredibly exciting. So with that, I want to introduce the team, and I have to say we have a great team assembled here, mostly in the front row, or in the front row and in the second row. And I just want to introduce the architects, the engineers, the attorneys, and the construction managers that we have with us today. Woodmere is moving forward with this project aggressively and quickly. We have a settlement date scheduled for mid-October. And we've been working really hard to get to this point, where we are now. So, with us tonight are our 3 architects, Matthew Baird and Teresa Ball of Matthew Baird Architects. Matthew, has been the master plan architect for Woodmere for a very long time. We've been kind of brothers on this journey for at least, 10 years or something. Matthew knows Woodmere better than anybody else. Matthew and Teresa are teamed up with Jeff Krieger, who many of you know, here in Chestnut Hill. Jeff knows St. Michael's Hall better than anybody else on the planet. And so the ability to bring, these 2 wonderful architects together has been, transformative, in terms of our efforts. Darren, Jose from Andropogon Landscape Architects. You're going to be hearing a lot from Darren tonight, especially because a lot of what we want to talk about is, the grounds and, how we believe the grounds have to change. Our engineers, we have 3 sets of engineers that we're working with. Keyston Hood are our civil engineers. They aren't with us tonight. Meliora are our water flow engineers, and Mark, sitting in the second row, is representing Meliora here tonight. Glad to answer any questions about watershed or water flow. And Jim Markham from Pannoni is our traffic engineer to get to this point and to understand parking and traffic flow, egress and entrance. We really needed to be, working with traffic engineers, and Pannoni is fantastic. It has been wonderful to work with Karen Sullivan. Also, sitting in the second row, Karen is one of the owners of Sullivan Construction, and to be able to work with architects and a construction manager together from the very beginning has accelerated the process for us immeasurably, and we are incredibly grateful for Karen's involvement. And then with us tonight, we're working with Deborah Solomon, attorneys. Deborah is our real estate and not-for-profit attorney that we work with on all kinds of projects at Woodmere all the time. Emily Christian is here from Deborah Solomon and Associates, and from Ballard Spar, David Guest and Devon Beverly are our land use architects. So again, we're very, we're going to hear from first Jeff, then Darren, then Matthew, and then we'll take questions after that. Very good. Okay, so that's enough from me. And with that, I'd like to introduce Jeff Krieger. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. As Bill said, there will be several meetings in the coming months, and I now know to ask that I not follow Bill. All right. So my wife, Kim, and I have lived in Chestnut Hill for about 35 years, and I started my own architectural practice here about 25 years ago. Our office is right next to Killian's Hardware. For anybody that knows Chestnut Hill knows where Killian's is located. Right. And as Bill alluded to, we were actually involved in St. Michael's Hall starting about a year ago. We were approached by a group of near neighbors who had heard that the property was potentially going up for sale. And they wanted to ensure that they had a say-so in how the property was developed. So we were brought in to do a feasibility study to look at potential uses, zoning codes, parking, traffic issues, and come up with some schemes that would work in concert with what the neighbors' intentions were. And they were seriously interested in a very low density development. They did not want to see a multitude of houses propping up on the land near them. So if I could have the next slide, please. Okay. Do I need to push a button? Okay. Okay. There we go. Okay, thanks. So we spent the fall looking at various development options to see what was possible. And one of the first things we did was to study the zoning, which, as Bill mentioned, is residential. It's Rsd3 zoning. And this is the site plan showing the maximum potential number of lots that are as of right. In other words, this plan, believe it or not, would comply with the current residential zoning in the city of Philadelphia. And it yields potentially up to 23 very small single-family homes. No one in our client group or on the design team thought that this was a desirable outcome. But we just wanted to illustrate what could be done without going through any type of variance process. We looked at the convent building and what could be done with that. Could it be turned into condominiums? We had an economic analysis done, and it was determined that renovating that building for residential use was really not economically feasible, that the cost of renovation versus what the units could sell for just didn't justify taking on the renovation. And while nobody in our client group wanted to tear the building down, it was apparent that in the hands of another developer, that was by far the most likely outcome. So what we ultimately concluded was that to be in alignment with the neighbor's desire for very low density, that the best solution for this property was to find a nonprofit with the financial resources to renovate the building for their use and conserve as much of the open space as possible. We didn't know who that nonprofit was, but that was where we ended up. And lo and behold, in walks the Woodmere Art Museum. And this was something that seemed to be just a tremendous benefit in terms of the neighbors and in terms of many of the other community groups that were aware of the potential sale of the building. So Woodmere's vision, as Bill has described and as you will hear from others tonight, really is in near perfect alignment with many of the community groups and stakeholders, the Friends of the Wissahickon, the Chestnut Hill Conservancy, the Community Association, and many of the near neighbors. So there are some challenges, though, to Woodmere's use of this building and site. As Bill mentioned, there are zoning code limitations that will require a change of use. There will be additional parking that you'll hear more about tonight. There are some building code constraints. The building was originally built in the 1850s. It was added onto multiple times. It's on many different levels, so accessibility is a serious concern. Again, we think that the architectural team has come up with a reasonable solution to address accessibility. And there's building code constraint issues as far as converting this, what was originally a single family summer cottage, into a public building. So there's egress issues, there's fire separation issues, so forth. But we're confident that the Woodmere has assembled the right team to tackle these issues and constraints, both in terms of the site, the zoning, and the building. And our goal is to create a tremendous community asset that will outlast most all of us. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Darren from Andropogon, who will talk about the initial concepts for the site. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about site. That is the wrong direction. We'll start in the right direction. And we, being landscape architects, always try and start big and work our way down. So I'll talk a little bit about site context. Okay, how's that? All right. So again, starting at this level, I think we've talked about this a little bit, but it's important to touch on this notion of place, and that's something that's really important to Woodmere. It's really important to Andropogon and understanding our community members, not just residential, but institution. We at Andropogon have actually worked with a lot of these other institutions and these neighbors in the neighborhood, but I'll touch on it a little bit more later in the presentation why these adjacencies are important, particularly the institutional adjacencies. It's also important to sort of understand, Bill had talked about the connectivity of these two properties and how they're so close together, but starting to think about what's the visualization of that connection. Oh, thank you. And we've kicked around the idea of an art trail. So what is that procession? What is that experience moving between those two properties? Something that we've definitely thought about and are working through. As you get to the site level, this is an aerial of St. Michael's Hall. Give you a little bit of an orientation in terms of entryways, maintaining those two access points off Germantown and off Sunset. Gives you a sense of the character of the place in terms of the canopy trees, these majestic estate trees, as well as the balance between paving and open space. I think it's important to talk about the wonderful advantages that we're going to look to leverage on this property, in particular the character. I think we've talked a lot about that, but it's important to talk about how the beautiful building and the architecture engages with the landscape itself. I think there's some really wonderful opportunities to take advantage of there. Obviously, the mature canopy trees we talked about as elements in the landscape and ensuring the long-term health of those as far as the development is concerned. And then also the space in between. So what are those, how are we going to maintain those open spaces, those vistas that are created and are framed through those canopy trees? And we've talked about connectivity between Woodmere and this property, but also we want to, getting back to context, how are we connecting to those natural systems adjacent to us? How are we improving the health and the ecological performance of the property itself? And I think the Wissahick and Park is a great example of that. And I think that's something we're going to definitely look to inspiration or look to for inspiration. Advantages don't go without challenges. So some of those challenges that we're looking to overcome, first and foremost, I think, is the age of the infrastructure, the site infrastructure in particular, because the property was developed in the early 1800s. That site infrastructure is failing, and there's certain things we're going to have to address there. While many of the canopy trees are in wonderful condition, several of which are in not great condition and will need to be addressed or removed. And we've already started to engage with Morris Arboretum and the urban forestry team to start to assess the health of the overall tree canopy and develop an action plan to move forward. Access is a big part of this project. And right now, the main focus of access is really around the vehicle. And we really want to start to shift that and address what we need to from a vehicular perspective, but also make sure that there's adequate pedestrian access and, more importantly, universal pedestrian access to the site. The arrival sequence is something right now, again, it's focused on the vehicle. We want to try and change that a little bit. Parking is something that Jeff talked about, obviously needing to address that. And then this property being within the Wissahick and watershed, we have to be keenly aware of how we're impacting that watershed in particular as it relates to steep slopes. So that's a really important thing that we talked about and thought about as we were developing the overall site design. So this is the site plan as it stands right now. Again, it's very much in conceptual form. However, before we get into that and start to break it down a little bit, I want to talk about some of the bigger project goals that we thought about and that really fed into this design before pencil hit the paper. And I talked about adjacency early on. And you'll notice with this plan, I can use the laser pointer here, the center of gravity that you'll see here in terms of the design, both as far as parking is concerned, vehicular circulation, drop-off, also this wonderful new multi-purpose building here, all sit on a portion of the site that addresses a institutional adjacency. In other words, we really wanted to maintain this design in a way that minimized the change and character of the landscape adjacent to our residential neighbors. So that was a really important thing. Related to that, when you think about the sort of pragmatic aspects of the design that need to go into this project from a site perspective, so you think about parking, you think about loading, you think about any site lighting that needs to occur. Again, trying to focus all of those interventions in an area where it's going to minimize the impact to our neighbors. Talked about the enhancement of the canopy trees. While again, we're trying to maintain as many of them as possible, I think we have to understand that they're all fairly mature. We have to think about what is that next generation going to look like of not only trees, but multi-story layer of landscape. What is the biodiversity on this site is something that we thought a lot about. So that's, thinking about native plants, again, looking to the Wissahick and as inspiration to how that might influence this landscape design was really important. And then responsible solutions to site infrastructure. What does that new infrastructure look like? What are the different ways we can envision a more passive way of managing stormwater, for example? So we'll talk about, things like porous parking, best management practices in terms of stormwater management. All those things are really important and are fundamental to this design as a whole. And then, as I mentioned, increasing biodiversity. So as we get into the sort of nuance of this design, we'll sort of walk through the various aspects of it. The first being the vehicular-based design. And as you'll see here, we've maintained both of the entries, changed them slightly in that they're both going to be exit and entrance. One is more focused on the left here in Germantown towards passenger vehicles, whereas the southern entrance off Sunset is going to be passenger vehicles as well as intermittent service and bus and deliveries that would occur to the site. So again, that loading experience, really pushing it as far as we can into the site, buffering it as much as possible, really minimizing the impacts. You'll notice here the drop-off has been pulled back, and what that does is it frees up the entire front portion of the arrival sequence and really gears that towards sort of your pedestrian experience as you come to the site. Parking, as you'll notice, is really interdispersed, and there's a couple of reasons for that. One is that we really want to break up the volume of that parking from a visual perspective. So as you approach the site, we don't want you to see a monolithic parking lot pushed right up against the property line. It's really important we sort of modulate that sort of relationship of pavement to the edge of the property line and allow vegetation to sort of move in and out. It was also done because, again, we're trying to avoid as many trees as possible. And lastly is by creating smaller surface areas, again, by and large, we're really going to try and use porous paving as much as possible, but where you can't use porous paving, creating smaller surface areas of pavement allows us to create smaller micro bioretention facilities to manage the water that comes off of those surfaces. So really a lot of thought went into kind of how that parking sits on the site. From a pedestrian perspective, again, it was really important to establish those gateways. So you have two more formal gateways for pedestrians coming off Germantown. That speaks to, number one, the connection to the property we're sitting at now, but also it starts to think about public transit. What are the different ways people are going to be arriving to this site in the future? We also have a more informal along the east side that leads up on a pathway up the hill. Once you get into the site, you're sort of circulating on several different scales. The larger, sort of more thick lines are sort of our primary paved pathways. And one of the reasons you see this sort of looping back serpentine patterns is because of those steep slopes that I mentioned early on. Universal access and accessibility is really important to Woodmere. And to do that, it requires a little bit longer distances. So that is the intent there. You have sort of a secondary system of pathways that might be a little bit more direct, get you from point A to point D. They're slightly smaller in scale. We vary materials, make softer materials. And then you have a tertiary system, which are more ephemeral ways of circulating through the site. You think of the sort of a mown path through a meadow. That's sort of what we'd like to see. And what that does is it broadens your experience within the landscape. It allows you to sort of experience the landscape in different ways from season to season, from year to year, things of that nature. And then the framework, the bones of those trails and those paths allow for some of the most important exterior spaces. So the main to the north, the garden terrace is sort of a mixed use or a multi-use space. It'll be open, sort of open lawn, but allows for a variety of events and activities to occur out within the landscape. As I mentioned, in the center piece is you have your main arrival plaza, which is sort of the confluence of all of the pathways that arrive to the future museum, and then a smaller cafe terrace here, which Matthew will talk a little bit about in the future, and a meadow overlook, which is sort of overflow space that could be used for that cafe space. And then lastly, what we have is the children's garden to the south here, which is basically an outdoor education space that is sort of nestled in between this new multi-use building and the existing building. From an open space perspective, we've tried to maintain this intact as much as possible in terms of preserving the percentage of open space to built space. But one of the things that's important about this particular plan is right now the landscape is somewhat monolithic in terms of its treatment. And what getting back to my earlier point about biodiversity, we felt it was appropriate to create a little bit more gradation within the landscape, in particular of areas of steep slope. So we've allocated quite a bit of portion of the property to Meadow, which does quite a few things. It increases the biodiversity, which I talked about. It's also more effective at managing water. So on steep slopes, we want to absorb as much of that water as possible and not permit it to run off the property. It also reduces, because it is on steep slopes, the maintenance burden on the facilities team at Woodmere, which is really important. Again, the garden terrace would be maintained as an open lawn area. The grove just to the south would be maintained in very much the same way it is today. However, again, it will be augmented with additional plant material to think about that next generation. And then to the east and to the south are these sort of lush evergreen and mixed deciduous buffers and vegetated areas that, again, mitigate the sort of visual impacts of the parking. And then within those areas, we have several stormwater management features and rain gardens. I will also point out in this plan, you'll see several sort of red dots. Those indicate the trees at this point that are slated to be removed, again, for various reasons. Several of them, in talking with Morris Arboretum, are not in good health or don't have a particularly long lifespan ahead of them. Others were just either non-native species that were not in the best location. And with that, this is the plan, but I will turn things over to Matthew. Thank you.
Hi, it's great to be here. And I'm here with Teresa Ball from my studio. Behind us in New York are Alice Chai and Liz Z, who helped us with much of the work tonight. We're going to jump right in because we don't want to keep you longer than you'd like. And I'll tell you, when I was a kid, yeah? Is that better? So when I was a kid, my parents were divorced, and one of the great things that happened to me as a kid is that my father remarried a wonderful woman from Chestnut Hill. And he announced that we were going to move here. Of course, that's tough news for a kid. But it turned out to be an amazing experience and a wonderful chapter and really led me here today. She was an artist and actually took painting classes here at Woodmere. And one of the things I remember about the time I spent here growing up was that there was a collective communal sense of loss that was part of the fabric of Chestnut Hill. And these are some of the things that we talked about. My stepmother's uncle built the famous place, the Newbold Estate, Lavrock, and her family also built the Star Lavrock Estate. And then, of course, you have White Marsh Hall. And when she was a kid, you could ride a horse from White Marsh Hall to Lavrock and cross dirt roads. And so much has changed in this community in that time. But to me, that sort of walking around the ruins of White Marsh Hall with my dad, hearing about what it was like when he was a kid, and then, most recently, hearing about the demolition of Lavrock was very impactful on me as an architect. And so it's so exciting to be a part of a chance to save a piece of that really important historic fabric. And I think we can go to the next slide. So we came to work on a master plan and work with Bill and his team, Ann and others here at Woodmere. And that was 10 years ago. And we've had so much a great experience working on this building in this landscape. And so when Bill called us and said, hey, I want you to come look at this St. Michael's Hall, I thought, wow, we've got so many problems at Woodmere to take care of all those things that we identified to take care of. I can't do that. That's too much. But he said, no, you really have to come down and see this building. We came down and absolutely fell in love with this building. And suddenly I realized the genius of this, which is here is an institution that has done such an incredible job taking care of a historic house for over 100 years. Who is better suited to take care of another one? The institutional know-how and the ability to care for something like this is in the DNA of Woodmere. And we knew that from our master planning, and I shouldn't have been so simple-minded in the beginning. We also knew that Woodmere needed a great deal of things, drastically short of exhibition space relative to the size of the collection. And we identified various ways to create exhibition space, all of which were limited on this site. There's also a huge lack of storage for art here. So suddenly when you preserve this house and you convert it to a museum, you not only save a piece of architecture, but you also solve a huge problem for this institution, which is getting its art to be accessible and telling the story of Charles Knox Smith and Woodmere in a very powerful way. And yeah.
So hopefully everyone will get to see St. Michael's Hall soon, but it's got just gorgeous interiors, and the sisters took very good care of the interior of this building. And so while there's plenty of modifications to be made, certainly for practical reasons, there's so much of this building that can be preserved under Woodmere's care. And I think, you see all these amazing examples of original millwork that can be preserved and restored. And so this is really, I think it's a perfect match.
And we should say that the Sisters of St. Michael's Hall have done an incredible job keeping care of this building. They bought it in 1924, and when we walked into it, it was astounding the quality of the care, and the place has had a perfect roof on it for 100 years. There's no sign of rot in the timbers. The historic plaster vaulting was never laden with a dropped asbestos ceiling. The original woodwork is intact. It's amazing. And so hats off to them for allowing this to happen. And I think we should go to the next slide. So when we sat down as architects do and make sketches, we thought of 3 interventions that could, we think, improve the site programmatically, which is a fancy way of saying, how could we make it better in terms of its experience? So we thought, well, the porch could be renovated bring it back to its historic original state. It's a beautiful piece of architecture. We could add a cafe. There's an incredible dining porch that's on the northwest side of the building, and we could make a wonderful cafe for the museum. And then we could create a multi-purpose space for bringing in groups like this, community groups, for things like this, and lectures by artists and such. And those were kind of 3 above and beyond restoring the building and turning it into an incredible exhibition facility, pieces of program we would add. And when we first started to think about that in terms of 3D, this was a very preliminary sketch. And I would say that all of this is very preliminary. So if you have some great ideas, we are open. We think that it would be a fantastic thing to be able to walk from the cafe onto a vibrant terrace that overlooks the incredible landscape that Darren just described. On the top of the cafe, we could have a roof garden that had even better views of the meadows. And we could connect. One of the things that's troubling about this building, as from a pure mechanical perspective, is it has many different levels, which is why it's beautiful and bucolic, but very challenging, as Jeff said, from accessibility. So putting in an elevator and doing that in a sensitive way, that connects all the levels. And those were kind of our first sketches. And then we can just walk you through a first pass at the plans.
Yeah, so these are, again, very schematic, but it really just gives you a sense of all of the positive things that Woodmere is going to bring to the building. So starting with the basement, it was a giant kitchen before, so it really lends itself to some sturdy program like the kids center, loading, storage, new kitchen. The key component here is the orange box, which is the new elevator. And this is really the only spot where you can get access to every floor from a single elevator. So we looked at a lot of different spots for the elevator, and you would need 2 elevators to access all the different levels unless you put it really essentially in the center here. So on the first floor, you come in, we maintain the original.
Do you want me to be the?
Yeah, thanks. It's important to maintain the original entry. This is a grand entry. It's got that beautiful door that we all love. And then you see we're really maximizing gallery space here. It's all about sort of stripping back any extra divisions that have been made over the years and keeping these gorgeous proportions of the original rooms, turning them into galleries. We've got cafe, outdoor cafe, and then restoring the original 2 green spaces you see are the performance event spaces that have the really lovely millwork.
And this was the breakfast room originally, can you say?
Yeah, what's labeled performance 2 was originally the breakfast room.
And the dining room.
And dining. So I'm going to go up. So then you see second floor is almost all gallery. And then we've got that outdoor roof deck, which would be a lovely spot. And finally, top floor, more gallery, which is going to include storage for some art storage, a little research office, and it's also accessible by elevator, which is great.
And all of this would more than triple the gallery space for Woodmere. That's a huge thing. 17,000 square feet of new space at St. Michael's.
All right. So here's the outside.
Okay.
And we can always welcome Darren up if he has anything. This is really where it all comes together, I think, with all the disciplines.
Yeah, these are fun drawings because Darren drew the landscape and we drew the building. So I feel like you should really be up here. But we'll just walk you through. So a view as you come in the historic drive from Germantown, you can see the restored porch, and we'll restore the building. We'd like to bring back the historic windows, building a cafe that's much more glass so that it seems like the original porch that was open. And then you can see this approach to parking, which is, as Darren described, is not building a huge sea of asphalt. It's tucking in clusters of small groups of cars and surrounding them with landscape. That's a really important part of the design. Looking at the cafe from the Meadow, we have, whoops, how did I do that? We have this wonderful dining pavilion opening onto a terrace, and using the Wissahick and schist that we find in the building, then starting to build out into the landscape. And there you can see the side of what we're proposing, which is this subterranean space, much like this, buried down a few steps, and with a grass roof so that it's very unimposing on the neighborhood. And now we're walking around through the Meadow, looking back up at the dining cafe and the stairs coming down into the landscape and the back of the pavilion. Sorry, I don't mean to hog the mic.
No, you're doing great.
Okay. We're a team. Coming around to the backside of the multi-purpose space, you can see the little clusters of parking and the original building. And I think we have one more.
That's it.
That's the site plan. Yeah. And that's our presentation. Now we're into questions, Q&A. Does anyone have questions? And what we can do is we can assign the mic to whomever is best suited to answer the question. Okay, great.
Can you say something about the current heating and air conditioning in the building?
Well, it's currently heated with oil-fired boiler, and the air conditioning is window units. All of this, unfortunately, has had its day and needs to go. We're going to replace it with state-of-the-art, environmentally sensitive choices, including ground-sourced heat pumps. So we're going to try to get away from fossil fuels if we can.
I was interested to know how you came up with the size of the cafe and whether you looked at demand, likely demand, by days of the week in comparable museums. Because I wouldn't think necessarily there'd be a high demand for a cafe, at least a large cafe, unless the one over the other old place is closed or whatever the cafe economics are, I'd be interested in.
Yeah, I would just say that Bill should jump in, but the cafe in an art museum is a great combination. Free Wi-Fi, great coffee, and a place to go take meetings. This is an incredible benefit. And how did we come up with the size of it? Well, it existed. And you can see in this plan, we're actually holding the original length of the dining porch. And then we're adding on an addition to give it just a little bit more width down towards the meadow. But it's the same length as the existing porch. Yeah.
I was just going to say something really quickly about the cafe, but I think, Matthew answered it. People come to Woodmere all the time and say, "Can I please get a cup of coffee?" And at the same time, this is, really important. One of the few real ways that museums can earn revenue is from, party spaces. And, this is not going to be a wedding space, but it can be a place to have, for example, a dinner. Even for Woodmere's own events, we were planning a dinner for the Larry Day opening, and, we have dinners in our boardroom catered. We can fit 15 people. That's not nearly enough. So it has been in Woodmere's strategic plan for a long time to have a space that could accommodate food. You can't just set up tables in a space like this because we have, paintings borrowed from museums across the country, and food and art generally don't mix. So having a purpose-built space, where somebody, can have a cup of coffee, is really something that Woodmere has needed for a long time. And, and you asked about demand. I mean, there's definitely demand, for a cafe space.
One of the online questions was, what about handicap parking and drop-off?
Yes. So, as I mentioned, accessibility is a really important part of this design. So from a handicap parking perspective, these spaces right here create an opportunity for both access to the multi-use space here, as well as access to elevators and up to the main portion of the existing house, as well as here could access one of the things that it's fairly subtle detail at this point, but one of the things we look to do here in terms of your arrival sequence to the main entry of the museum is that there are these small eyebrow stairs, and what we want to do, or what we'd like to do, is regrade that so you have more of a easy flush transition, so no need for ramps. So we've definitely thought about handicap accessibility and handicap parking.
Conceptually, can you walk from Woodmere to the site up Green Tree Road?
Could you, the question was, can you walk from up Green Tree to the site from Woodmere?
Yes.
So Currently, that would be challenging, only because there is, for those who are familiar with this site, going towards Green Tree, there is a fairly abrupt retaining wall that goes down onto Bell's Mill and then transitions to Green Tree. So not that it couldn't be done, it would require some alterations to this site to allow for accessibility up to the St. Michael's Hall site, but theoretically it could be.
I would just add, I think it's in the culture of this place to reinforce Germantown Avenue, and to use Germantown Avenue reinforces the culture of this place, Main Street. Anything we can do to increase pedestrian activity on Main Street is positive, I think.
Oh, Laurie?
This is also inspiring and exciting. I'm wondering, I didn't see the root cellar that is there. What are your thoughts about repurposing that?
I thought it was a wine cellar. You think it's a root cellar?
Oh, well, it would definitely be a wine cellar now.
It's a fantastic space, and we thought it would be part of the children's experience in the children's courtyard, and it could be restored and made into a really interesting grotto for kids. That's a really good question, and I don't have the exact dimensions. 2,500 square foot footprint, something like that. Yeah, 50 by 50. It's a perfect square.
The art school hasn't been mentioned. Do you see any role for students getting taught art at studios in this building?
I'm sorry, the question I think is there an art school in this new building?
Yes.
Oh, no, I was referring to the painting classes that are taught here at this site.
No, I understand that. I just wondered whether there's any thought given to some classes being held over there or some space being dedicated to studio.
So one of the things we've also always wanted at Woodmere is a studio space that's designed for children. So the plan, as of now, is to take the kitchen space. There's sort of a basement level kitchen. It has a tile floor. It has metal counters. I mean, it's almost already, set up for kids to get messy and make art. Has a drain in the floor, so you just hose everybody off. And one of the reasons why it's very hard to have an adult art space and a children's art space in the same space is because there are completely different needs. If you've ever been to a children's art making space in a museum, the sinks are like there. And it's actually something we've always wanted to have at Woodmere, and we feel there's an opportunity to achieve that at St. Michael's Hall.
Bill, if I could just add on to this, for those who have probably not been to St. Michael's Hall, this section here is one story below the main floor and walks out directly at grade. So when Bill called this a basement, it is below the first floor by one story, but it's actually walk out with windows on two sides and a door. So it doesn't feel like a basement. It's not the right connotation in terms of the character of the space. But that's also, as Darren was talking about, how one can get from the accessible parking spaces into the building at the lower level as well as the upper level.
Have asked us to speed it up. All right. So. Speak up. Speak up.
Probably both.
I think there's a question. Yeah, okay, we're going to speak right into the microphone like this.
The other
You know, these are such preliminary, I mean, this is being recorded, so, you know, this presentation will be accessible. However, you know, these changes, these drawings will be different tomorrow. They're working drawings. I'm not, you know, not sure how much utility there is in having them posted, but we're glad to show them to anybody who wants to see them. Question, yeah.
Have you looked at the water runoff issues that are on the Sunset side of the property?
So I think that's for Darren or maybe for Mark. Or
yeah, I can. So water runoff issues along Sunset, along the streetscape, or interior to the site?
Well, along the streetscape, it would impact that line that's on the interior as well as
Yes.
the exterior.
So the intention is, as I mentioned, touched on a little bit before, but the idea is that we had drawn a couple, in the diagram there were a couple indications of rain gardens. I talked about porous paving, which will mitigate some of that issue, but also what I didn't note is that this buffer along here not only will act as a vegetated buffer, but it'll act as a bioswale. So the idea is that predominantly the grading along this side of the site runs in this direction. So the contours run this way, the water runs downhill this way. We've also indicated here that there's a large catchment area, a rain garden there to catch any water that's coming down this new driveway. But between these elements, and again, keeping the pavement areas as small as we can, using porous paving where we can, and then using bioretention areas directly adjacent to them so you're capturing the water sooner, not allow it to get ahead of steam and get downhill is the key. So catching that drop of water as close to where it falls on the ground is the most important thing, and that's the overall strategy with this entire corridor right here. So you're going to see, you know, wherever possible, micro bioretention facilities to catch that water, manage it, so it doesn't leave that line right there. That can't happen. On the cursor, there we go. Okay. So what I was referring to, for those who couldn't see the laser pointer, is micro bioretention facilities here, here, and down here, as well as using this as a buffer, but also a bioswale where possible to manage that water that's coming off of these non-porous surfaces. And then ultimately, I had mentioned a larger rain garden down here.
That is it from the online question. Any other from the...
I actually want to ask Matthew and or Teresa, there was a question about the multi-purpose building and like what size is it, and it's a really, I think, incredibly exciting and amazing design for what it does in terms of achieving a volume of space without really creating a big building. And I mean, I know that sounds contradictory, but it's part of what makes the design so interesting to me. And I was wondering, Matthew, if you would just, you know, talk a little bit about, you know, the nature of that space. And again, I mean, we have chairs and audio set up in a gallery, which is frankly disruptive to the life of an institution. I mean, this is one of the only places that we can have a meeting like this. We need, and again, it's been on our bucket list of most urgent things for Woodmere, actually probably more important than a cafe, is a space that is set up with, you know, audio visual built into the walls and the ceilings and seats that we don't have to drag out the chairs. And so this was an extraordinary opportunity to work. Well, I want you, Matthew, to talk about the creativity of it, because it's an incredibly creative solution, and I don't want that to be missed.
I don't know if I can deliver on that, but I'll try. What's a rare thing about this is often when you're making a collective space, it's big. And what's really special about this is that it's quite small. And that makes for an intimate space for groups of sizes like this. that's, I think, a really wonderful thing to be commissioned to do as an architect, is to make something that's not huge. And our thought is to have a raked floor, although we would study a level floor, but a raked floor helps if you're trying to go down into the ground. So you would enter on the high side by the children's garden or from the parking, and then the rooftop is taken from the geometry of the existing roofs, which are hipped roofs. So it's just a very large hip roof made of a green roof. And that's it. We're bringing in natural light at the sides and trying to make a small, intimate, collective space. I had a question, if there's no other questions from the audience. Well, my question is, how did we do? What do you think? No, but seriously, I mean, what do you think? It's a lot of change, and I'm just curious if anyone had any observations about what they think about it.
We can fit in the multi-purpose building space.
100
100 max.
max, yeah. Not socially distanced, so. Any other questions or thoughts? Here, we have a traveling mic there. Yeah.
So Stephen asked about a particular work of art that's very large in Woodmere's collection. It's a 19th century painted scenic curtain by the artist Russell Smith, and it's pretty spectacular. And yes, in fact, we were thinking that it could have a home, in this space. And we've actually talked about it, and there are a number of really wonderful large pieces of art in Woodmere's collection. The Nicola Descenzo window, which is a spectacular work of art, we're intending that to be the focus of this rebuilt porch space, that we'd like to have as a cafe. And of course, as I think probably everybody here knows, it was from Horn and Hard Art. So it would be really nice for it to have, a life in a place that's a cafe. The one thing I wanted to say about the porch is completely rotted. One of the things that we learned early on when a building inspector came along was that this porch has to go. It's a rotted, soft, spongy, it's unsafe. And so, with the idea that it had to come down, the question was, well, how do you rebuild it? And it just seemed like, why rebuild it, exactly the way it was? Why not take advantage of, the space that we have? And, as Matthew and Teresa showed, keep it the same length. That proportion seems right to the building. Although, those of you who've been inside will remember it's quite narrow on the inside. I mean, it's really too narrow for, a table. And so just capturing, 3 or 4 feet, something like that. I mean, it's a minor intervention, but will make a big difference to the functionality of the space. And, since it has to be rebuilt, it seemed like, why not take advantage of it as a beautiful design feature?
We just have some comments from the audience. Thank you, sounds great. Love the idea of going to this space, a cafe, with the exclamation marks.
Yeah.
Looking forward to see more and sharing the presentation with friends. Another audience member that we think we find is various.
That's wonderful. And I would say, I do want to thank all of you for coming and joining us, but I want to thank everybody on the team. We've got an amazing team working with. You don't always find yourself, sitting around a table with people that you absolutely love working with. And that's what this has been like. And, I just want to offer my, thanks, to everybody for just being really great partners in this process. This is the first iteration. This is, nothing here is, scriven in granite yet, and we don't own the building yet either. So, so there will be many more such meetings, and we really do want everybody's feedback. I mean, that is the purpose of this tonight. Yeah. So we're looking to settle on the property in the month of October. So here we are, and David, is the person in the room who knows the city permitting process better than anybody. We think we're being aggressive in thinking that we could have our permits done by the end of 2022. And we're going to push for that. But that seems like a best case scenario in terms of permitting. If we can get our permits by December 22, we'd love to have shovels in the ground in spring 2023. So, I think that's what we're thinking about in terms of timeline at this point. Yeah.
One more comment from a neighbor. Congratulations to the Woodmere team. You're going to be sitting at the top. Thank you for your thoughtful planning. The neighbors are so grateful for your college continue over a cup of coffee.
Oh my God. Yeah.
Another person is asking if it would be great to see a virtual tour or a person tour to understand the plan.
Yeah.
Even if it would be related to our concept.
Yeah. Well, we're going to have a big party. So, yeah. 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 Jamie.
When we were talking about this, there was a concept of floor-to-ceiling gallery space. Is that still part of the concept?
Yeah, absolutely. So Alfred Craven Harrison, who was responsible for, pretty much creating the building as we know it. He hired Cope and Stewardson in the 1890s to renovate the interior space. And he was an art collector. He was on the board at PAFA. And I just have to imagine he had floor-to-ceiling art. He had an important art collection. And, our intent is to hang the collection salon style from floor to ceiling in the manner in which that building, would have accommodated, the Harrison collection, which was an important collection. And, one of the great things about St. Michael's Hall, and I think, Richard, you'd said this, it's a better building for hanging art than most of Woodmere. Aside from this space that we're in now, the spaces have great ceiling heights, there are large expanses of space for hanging art, and the rooms have beautiful proportions. Once we, remove, the sisters, there were, between 20 and 25 sisters living in the space at one time. But, the amazing thing is that they were just very expeditious in the interventions that they made in the space. And so it's going to be very easy to remove those things, these very provisional kinds of walls that they built to partition out the space and restore. Really, we're going to be restoring the space to what it was and, maximizing, the art space. Yeah. Yeah.
I think that's very exciting.
Yeah.
I would, at some point in the presentation, I would suggest we have a rendering showing art on display.
Yeah.
Really at the heart of it.
That's coming. We have some renderings that I've shown that were, made by our wonderful interns over the summer, and Matthew and Teresa are working on some new renderings that will, be really beautiful, and that we'll share with everybody real soon. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, so Jamie's question was about, what is our vision for the experience in terms of how the collection will be presented, right? Is that the core of your question? And, what I see when I walk in there is floor-to-ceiling, salon-style presentation of art, which, which is what that building was built for, and I think it will look spectacular. And it's what this space was built for. If you look at the way Charles Knox Smith hung this very gallery that we're in, it was floor to ceiling, and the idea was that each person would have their own exploration. Nobody was expected to look at everything, but the idea was that by presenting this great array of things, people could find the stuff that was interesting to them, and that they would keep coming back, because every time you came, you would say, well, I'm gonna journey up, through this direction. And so it's a very different kind of concept of a museum experience than what we've become used to in the 20th century, where you really have a sequential march, and you think of an exhibition like this as a narrative, that it has a beginning, it has a development, and then the exhibition comes to an end. That's not how a house like that would have been imagined as a place for art. Yeah. Well, so thank you again, everybody, and thank you, everybody on the team. It's really, really wonderful. And, we also, one-on-one questions, anytime, we are very grateful, for everybody's input and support, and want to create something that is embraced, by the community in a very deep and profound way. So thank you. Yeah.